morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to On the Couch with me, Martin Colcliffe. My guest today, for many of you, will need little introduction. However, I'm going to introduce her in a moment, but she wants you to bear in mind in 10 years' time when you're watching this, that this video was made during the lockdown and that her hair is not how she would normally keep. Typical vanity of a lady. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest this morning, Mrs. Sheila French. Sheila, good morning.
Good morning.
Lovely to have you on the couch and to be able to chat to you. We haven't seen each other for a while, although
No.
we have worked together in the past, you know, with things for the SNU, working at the Arthur Findlay College. And I've been a student of yours. And I think just before we ask you any questions, it's important that people know that other mediums, who people may class as experienced, go on other mediums courses because we're always learning. And I think that's important to mention at this point, because a lot of the interview this morning is going to be about your teaching and some of the exciting projects that you were just embarking on before COVID lockdown came about. And we are going to tell you about those, ladies and gentlemen. But the first thing I want to ask you, Sheila, is your love of spiritualism and mediumship is obvious. And what we'd like to know, and we're asking all the mediums this question, what brought you into it all?
You know, I think a lot of mediums give these stories about I had some great revelation, you know, spirit appeared to me and somebody gave me a reading and said I must do this. There's these moments that it started for them. And I haven't got that. I was a late starter. And until the age of 21, I was a practicing Christian, taught Sunday school. I was a leading figure within the church, and I'd been in that same church since I was 5 years old. Got married and got a bit distracted from Christianity, as marriage has a habit of doing. It takes your time. And then there was a long period where I was missing something to be passionate about spiritually. And my mother-in-law very sadly had motor neuron disease, known as ALS in Europe and the States. And there is no treatment and no cure. And we're going back for motor neuron disease. We're going back something like 36, 37 years ago when there was nothing. You were given a diagnosis and you went home to die and suffer from whatever circumstances it presented then. And my mother-in-law took healing, and which we later found out was a spiritual healer who was also within a mediumistic environment. And he took her funeral, and we went for a reading, as you do if you have that opportunity, to find out what came next for her. And then nothing, just literally nothing. We carried on with our life. I went into business, and then a friend of mine said, come to a psychic supper. No idea what a psychic supper was. Now here's the big question, Martin. Did I have the best reading of my life or the worst reading of my life? If I look at it as a teacher, it was the worst reading of my life and pure guesswork. But in it, she said to me, I'm running a circle. Do you want to join? It starts tomorrow. And I went along to a circle, and there were 30 chairs put out for this circle. Yeah, don't look impressed. There was only the leader and myself that arrived. And it was from that point that I began to be curious. And when I sat in that circle, I became aware that there was a man sitting opposite me in a chair, who I later found out was a man who was coming. There was supposed to be two of us there, and I later found out he didn't come. So psychically, I'd picked up that information. It was probably the worst circle I've ever seen run. I mean, truly, it was just chaos, disorganized, no education, but it gave me a taste for it. Then the next bizarre thing happened is I slipped a disc, went to a chiropractor without knowing what chiropractic was, and she began just by holding her hands still, just perfectly still over my back. And something in me said, why do I think this isn't chiropractic? And I didn't know what chiropractic was. It's blooming painful. But I didn't realize that at the time. And she said, I'm a spiritual healer, and tomorrow I'm going to the Arthur Findlay College on Open Week. Do you want to come? And so I did, and signed up for a course, and it began. But I think what's quite important about my story, Martin, is I knew nothing before I started. I had no big spiritual experiences at the beginning. I learnt it in a classroom from teachers.
Yeah.
And later those experiences came, you know. So I can't ever say I was born to be a medium or I have a gift of mediumship. I learned it kicking and screaming the hard way, you know.
Yes. Okay.
And
Yeah.
I know a lot of mediums say, oh, this happened and this happened. And then some students feel, well, I haven't had anything spectacular. Well, I didn't. The only really spectacular was the coincidence of meeting these people, you know.
Yes, yeah. Mine was similar. I was a late starter myself, but I was 42 when it started with me. I'd had minor events through life, which I didn't realise were the spirit world. You know, there used to be a little boy in my bedroom, but it terrified me, so I hid under my covers, which I've explained that on in other interviews. And the passage of my father opened it for me. I was one of those mediums that had these precise instructions, right down to the point where I went into Tunstall Spiritualist Church, which sadly is now closed. There was a photograph on the wall of Gordon Higginson, who'd passed away by then. This was 1997. And in my head, I just said to myself, I wonder who that is. And this voice said, that's Gordon Higginson. So I went to the president. I said, excuse me, is that Gordon Higginson? And he said, yes, it is. Why did you know him? I said, no, I've just heard the name in my head. Now, you'd think that would have inspired him. Oh, we've got fresh meat. But no, I had to go, like you, I went looking and sat in many bad circles. So anyway, it's about you, not me. When we were arranging the interview, and I like people to share the experiences. That's why I gave my experiences at the same time. When we chatted, arranging the interview, one of the lines that you put when I was asking you what you would like to talk about, you said that trance mediumship was your passion. Well, what got you into this form of mediumship?
Do you know, again, there's no amazing story. The first time I went to the college for a course, it was at Glyn Edwards, the late Glyn Edwards. Most of my teaching came from him. He terrified me and inspired me in equal quantity, and I think most people can say that story. And he split people into groups, and he put me into a beginners group, which was with Marcia Day, who Marcia Day was the very best teacher for me to have on my first experience.
Yeah. Because
everything is normal to Marcia. You know, I know she has ill health now, so she doesn't teach so much. But everything is acceptable. Whatever experience you have, it was perfectly normal. Well, I had the weirdest beginners group ever, because we did the first meditation and in the lounge at Stansted. And the first person went, oh, I had all of these television screens and there were different dead people on each television screen. I thought, well, I didn't have that. And then there was a man who said, oh, I met Zoe, my guide. She lives on the 7th plane and she's told me this room is dangerous. And I thought, well, I didn't get that. And it's interesting that you mentioned that as teachers, we still look for opportunities to learn and classrooms to go to, particularly if we're looking for something specific. And in that room was Margaret Nichols, who used to run, I've come one of the Scottish churches she used to run. And she was a president of a church, and she was in the beginners group, because she always says, I go in a beginners group once a year to remind myself where I came from, which was wonderful. So she was sat next to me. So she went, I just felt the love of spirit. And I thought, oh, maybe that's what I had. It wasn't what they had, but maybe that's what I had. So Marcia came to me next and she said to me, what was your experience, Sheila? And I said, well, I felt like I was a man. It was really weird. I just felt as though I'd become a man. And I had all these manly thoughts in my head. And she went, oh, that's normal. Don't worry about that. And just carried on. And it was the beginnings of trance, you know, and over the week it grew and grew. And every day she'd just say to me, oh, that's okay. And I'd say, but it's not the same as everyone else. She said, oh, don't worry about them. You just do it your way. And then at the end of the week, she sat me down and told me what had happened. So literally the first time I sat in any sort of development, I had an experience, a small experience of trance.
And that led you into now.
And from that point, I was hooked.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So as you've mentioned your teaching, so as well as the trance mediumship, I know you have a passion for teaching others, bringing them through in this. And I'd like you to tell us what you feel your strongest quality as a teacher is.
Yeah, and I think to say my passion is teaching is correct. Although I work with all the forms of mediumship, my greatest wish when I'm in a classroom is to find the trigger, the light that will help each individual student to enjoy their work. So to find out which ones need pushing to enjoy it, to find out which ones need supporting to enjoy it, to find out which ones need to just be left alone and play, you know. So my real passion is getting to know the students within their classroom situation as quickly as possible so that I can create the class for each individual. But, you know, I think, I hope it's not my ego, can't be 100% sure, but my greatest wish is to see a student do better than I did when I was at their point. Because I really learned mediumship kicking and screaming, you know. I fought it a lot, I argued, I resigned from the job. I can't remember how many times I resigned from being a medium. You know, God, I've had enough, I'm packing it up. You know, I really challenge. It was a big challenge to get to where I am now. So if I see someone who's a beginner or someone who's 1 year in or someone who's done 3 or 4 workshops, I want them to have it easier than I did at that point. I want it to be more comfortable for them. Because I realized I wasted a lot of time and energy fighting it, you know.
Lovely. Now we're getting to the part that I'm interested in, hope everybody else is going to be interested in. In the pre-chat ramble that we're having, you mentioned that you're working for several universities now. And your love of the sciences is reciprocated by I love the experiments and the science, but how did you get with these different number of universities, which sadly are on hold now because of COVID, but how did that come about?
So I'm involved with 7 different universities at the moment, right up to Durham, Cambridge, King's College, but they are originally all part of one research, which actually was in the Psychic News, which was called the Hearing Voices. And they were looking for mediums who were clairaudient to just fill in huge numbers of questionnaires. I mean, it took you like 2 hours to fill in these questionnaires and to do some very basic experimental tests. So I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. We went up to King's College and they needed 36 volunteers. And my colleague and myself were 37 and 38. And they said, oh, you sounded so enthusiastic on the phone. We wanted to meet you. But actually, we won't take your results into account this time, but we wanted you to come in part of the program. Well, Martin, when we began to look at it, we realized they had no controls in place to know if someone was clairaudient. They just took the medium's words. And when they started to tell us stories, it was clear not only had they not got mediums who knew what clairaudience was, they had people who weren't mediums. And it was very clear just from the stories that they were telling us. So we began to sit there and literally pull apart their research and sort of say, we cannot be controls. You have no controls over the controls. And we were controls for treatments for schizophrenia. And schizophrenics hear voices. And 90% of schizophrenics will have a bad relationship with that voice. But they realized that there were about 10% of schizophrenics that maybe could be retrained to have a good relationship with the voice and not need these heavy duty medication. So it's sponsored by a drug company, believe it or not, who was trying to reduce the number of drugs. So they needed people who had an entirely good relationship with hearing voices as controls. Thankfully, we were the opposite end of the spectrum to the schizophrenics. I was a little bit worried we might be in the grey area, but we were completely the opposite. But in doing so, they realised that they had a lot of faults in their research programme. So there were many parts to this research, including fMRI, which is where you go in an MRI scanner and you do reading, writing, talking, all sorts of things in there. And we had to do mediumship. And various other interviews from different perspectives, but all within this one program. And every time we went to a different university with a different part of the research, we kept saying to them, these are not the right questions you can ask a medium. We cannot answer them with a yes or a no. You know, you're deciding. My dog's just greeting the postman. We're going to have that in your interview.
I love that, because my dogs, when I interviewed Libby, one of them jumped on my knee.
Well, this one, she's greeting the postman's clearly just arrived. But they realised that using mediums as a control was okay if you were just asking, are you comfortable hearing voices? But you can't say these definitions of it's a spirit voice unless you put it to the test in some way. So we took part in their original research program, which we're waiting now for all of the results. They send me them in bits and pieces from each university, but still compared to the schizophrenic results. And then from that point, I began then to get involved with talking personally to a lot of the professors and the researchers, who then began to research mediumship directly. So that we've got them now coming into the school once a year. We're doing research weekends once a year now. We were just going to have a great one, which literally should be starting tomorrow, and we're not going to have. But 2 guys coming in from Europe, which would have been amazing. But what it began to show me, Martin, that was really important from my perspective, and it is personal. I don't believe every medium should be passionate about science. They should be passionate about being close to the spirit world, but they don't have to be passionate about science. But if you have that sort of mind, and I believe if you want to be a good teacher, you need to understand the mind of your students and the mind of the medium, which is very individual. So what it began to do for me is I was able to ask them questions within the research that directly related to the act of mediumship. Does that make sense, the way that I put it? So that we all know that as teachers, we're psychologists. A lot of the time, we're untrained psychologists. We don't create mediums. We create the right environment for mediumship to grow. We can't teach someone to be a medium. We can only teach them knowledge which can help them to grow as a medium. So it really taught me that there were certain pieces of knowledge from this research that I could share with students that would make them understand there is no such thing as a block. You know, we're not allowed to use the word block at my school anymore. You can't be blocked. It's just something you haven't got enough information about yet. That's all. So it began to filter now that I'm not looking so hard at the research stuff. I'm looking at what is the research teaching me to be able to teach others, you know? So it's been fun. The fMRI was quite a challenge. There were 2 of us there, and the medium before came out and said I couldn't do mediumship in the fMRI, in the MRI scan. I've never had one before. I didn't know what to expect. It's on your brain, so you're locked in this little cabinet. Well, I wear hearing aids, and glasses. So they have to make you a pair of plastic glasses because you've got to read while you're in there. Have to take the hearing aids out, so they had to turn the volume up because there's this noise. So I went through this huge preparation and went into the room, and they said to me, "Oh, you're going to be in the MRI for an hour." We were in there for actually an hour and 15 minutes, or I was. So they said, "Do you want to take your shoes off and be comfortable?" So I said, "Oh, yes, please." And I'm not kidding you, Martin, we must have signed about 4 disclaimers before we got in this machine. One of which was, "Have you got any metal?" You know, and us women, we have bits of metal, you know, places that men don't have bits of metal. So you have to take all that off, you see. So I went in the room, took my shoes off, and before we started, my shoes walked across the room. And I went, "That wasn't the spirit world, it wasn't, they're not here yet." There were metal bars in my shoes that I didn't know. And the magnet was already drawing them in. And my shoes were walking across the floor. But they asked us to do clairaudience and clairvoyance specifically whilst in the machine. And I thought, I can do this. You know, Sheila French can do this. I don't have anything that stops me doing my mediumship. Physically, it was an enormous effort, to the point that I was sweating and slightly shaking in order to keep my energy with me to do mediumship in the MRI. And then when I came out, I said to them, "I want to see that bit. Tell me what you've learned from that bit." And one of the very interesting things that we're still looking at, so don't take me as a quotation on science, my understanding is still very small, but they believe people like you and I, Martin, that do mediumship regularly, it's become quite natural to us. We don't go through all the stress of huge opening, closing, and all that sort of thing. They believe that we've now created a part in our brain that is as natural as breathing. And they believe it's the reptilian part of the brain. I can't remember the posh name. One day I'll get it tattooed so I remember it. But it's the reptilian part of the brain which is redundant. And they believe mediums who find mediumship so natural have placed their mediumship in that part of their brain. So they're now not using this bit, and this bit. They're now using the one part that is as natural as breathing, which is very interesting, very exciting, and actually makes perfect sense.
The strange thing is that you've mentioned that for about the last 18 months, I've been teaching that.
Yeah.
We're using a different part of the brain where we're subduing everything, and this one part is for mediumship. And I haven't been on any research.
No, and it's all parts, it's all types of mediumship, you know. For the research, we did mostly evidential mediumship. I have done some trance work that's privately with them. It's not part of the research. I've had EEGs and things like that done while I'm in trance, but that's them doing their own offshoot with me, not part of hearing voices. And then when you understand that, Martin, which is the exciting bit to share with students, because the rest of it can be boring if you're not interested. I mean, I'm interested, so I don't find it boring. But the interesting part with students is that you realize when they're using their conscious mind, their subconscious mind, when they're putting effort into it, actually the moment you make it more natural for them, less stressful, less competitive, less measuring its success and failure in the mediumship, the more you make it more fun, more natural for them, actually it has to get better.
Yeah.
It has to, because they're not using all these different parts of their brain. It's becoming a natural part of their work. So you know, exams, which you and I both have and we've both assessed, we have to look at what effect that has on someone's mediumship. For some people, gaining a qualification, and I know you've written some and so have I written some, gaining a qualification is the right excitement and input for them, the right motivation for them. For other people, it can destroy their mediumship.
Yeah.
You know, because it's having fun and making it more natural. So it's been an interesting ride, working with the universities.
Well, leading on from that, one of the other things, you become a consultant for a research group at King's College London. So I've got to press you to carry on with this subject.
Yeah.
Tell us about the King's College.
Well, it's an interesting story because I think if my fellow researchers were sat beside me, they might not look as happy and smiley as I do when I tell the story. Because it began, they were just going for financial support, and it was an extension from this Hearing Voices, where they realized that they didn't have enough information about mediumship or mediums or their minds. So they wanted to get extra funding to look at mediums specifically, to then use them as better controls in the Hearing Voices. The Hearing Voices is going to go on for about 15 years, they think, in total, because it's part of new drugs being created as well. So they have to put those into use for 18 months and see what the results are and things like that. So they thought while they had time, if they could get money, they could look at mediums per se. So they had 4 days to get this funding thing in, requesting to the authoritative body. So they said to me, it's about 4 hours work for you to read all of these papers and the proposed experiments. And what we need you to say is just your opinion. If you were given this research, what would you think? Well, I don't think they were very happy by the time I finished with it, because the language that they'd used for mediumship was very incorrect in places. So I had to correct the way that they literally described things or named things. But their experiment was based on, they wanted to base it on what a medium was feeling when they were delivering mediumship. That was their base. But the form of mediumship they wanted to use was automatic writing. Now, you as an psychic artist, a spirit artist, will know more about this than I do. It's not something I work with. But they wanted to use the form of mediumship to be writing. So I said to them, how are you going to judge at what level the medium is writing? If it's inspirational writing, if it's physical phenomena, how are you going to judge how much spirit content is in that writing? So they said, well, we'll just ask them to connect to the spirit world. And I said, yes, but some writers will write inspirationally from their own spirit. Some could have complete control of the pen. Some could write in the style or the evidential wording of a particular communicator. There are about, I don't know, 100 different levels that you could write at and still be in contact with the spirit world. So they went, oh, we didn't know that. And they said, well, then maybe you should have asked before you started writing the experiment. Yeah. So they said, well, we thought what we'd do is we'd get mediums to do it in a demonstration in a church. So I said, oh, that's okay. And they said, well, we could perhaps put an EEG on them at the time so we could measure the level of consciousness that's there. So I said, so you're going to have a medium demonstrating to a congregation with an EEG cap on, and you want them to do their best work. So they said, yes, but we won't tell anybody it's an experiment. We'll just sit quietly in the back. I said, but they're wearing an EEG cap, you know. And I said, you know that legally you would have to, and they were going to film it as well. I said, legally you would have to tell everybody in that room that it's an experiment. No, we can't do that, because if we tell them it's an experiment, then we're artificially producing the results. So it was a chaos. It was an absolute chaos. So I ripped it apart in the politest and most scientific way that I could present it back to them. And they said, okay, we're going to delay it by 6 months. And of course, now we've got COVID as well. So I think they've probably got to wait to the autumn for funding again. But it's a challenge, isn't it? To scientifically analyze any medium is a challenge.
It is, yeah. And I've been on experience with Chris Rowe from Northampton, you know, through the Arthur Findlay College. And they've got an American model they use, and I can't run it down because the SNU are working with it. But when I knew Brenda went in, and Stephen, myself, I think Stella, And we're all saying, but you can't use this model. This is an American model. And it always amazes me why they build a model first and then they ask the mediums to play. Why don't they find some mediums,
absolutely,
build the model, and then play and adjust the model?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
The very best part of it for me was I had one occasion where I had a full EEG while in trance. That was just, I asked for it. I thought, I've given them my few hours of work. I said, you know what I'd love to do is I had the cap on for their work. I said, I would like to do a full EEG while in trance. And the results blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. And really was the greatest validation I've ever had. And we're now just beginning, that research is finished, so we're just beginning with 2 other guys to begin to look at that sort of stuff again. But the EEG is very individual, you know, and I think every medium is individual. It's very difficult to have a collective research for mediumship, you know. Yeah,
definitely. So I want to move back a little bit to students now.
Yeah.
Because you believe all students, and I believe that all students have an equal value to the spirit world. And people mention beginners, intermediate, advanced. I don't actually like those titles, because if you tell somebody, oh, you're the beginner, and it sort of puts them down. And I know from experience in the Arthur Findlay College, some people say they're advanced, and when you give them an advanced exercise, they're not at that level. You know, why do you think people use these titles, and do you agree with them?
So I'm like you, I don't agree with them at all. And I think they're used because and I'm not talking about the Arthur Findlay College, I think in general, teachers have in their head, I'm going to teach advanced exercises, I'm going to teach intermediate, I'm going to teach beginners. So they only want that level of student. What I prefer to do is have mixed classes. So if I set an exercise, I'll say, right, you've got to achieve this, or try to achieve this. I'm expecting a bit more, and I'm expecting a bit more. For me, every exercise in any form of mediumship we give, it can be tempered for what level the student is at. And that can be a psychological level, just not an ability level. You know, you can have more educated students that you can't push, so you can't give them really tough exercises. But I don't know about you, Martin, but I don't know that I could even call myself advanced, because I think if you call yourself advanced, you're actually saying there's very little left for you to learn. And I'd give up, I think, if that was the case. I'd get bored very quickly if that was the case.
And we learn something new every day. I was doing a book review the other day. I will plug the book again.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Have you got the new? You've got the new bigger version. If anybody buys the older version, it comes in 2 sections. One, you know, the theory part and the speeches separately. I've got 2 parts.
Stephen Upton put them together with his
great
publications. But I've read it twice. But when I was doing the book review, there was a bookmark in there, and strangely enough, it's what I've been teaching recently, and it goes back to what you were saying about this place in the brain. And when I thought, I always read a little bit just to show people that a lot of them are very old English, but how they can relate to mediumship throughout the ages and into the future, because that book's over 100 years old, the original. And it was about this place in the mind. And there was a bookmark, just what am I going to read about? And it opened, and it's like, wow, that's what I'm going to read as the review. And again, it's about this place in the mind. So I learned, although I've read it several times, it's sort of, that's what you've been teaching for the last 18 months. And there it is. Now, was that latent? So you learn something new every day.
So for me, I think we have to be very careful the titles that we give students. I prefer personally to teach mixed ability groups. I think the more advanced can learn from the beginners, and the beginners can learn from the more advanced. But I always say, unless you're learning basic technique, everybody's intermediate. Everybody.
I agree. I don't class myself as advanced, because you sort of, I say I'm experienced, but I don't say I'm advanced, because I've had 24 years experience. Well, this is my 24th year now, since I was awakened, whatever you want to call it. But I've never heard any of the the tutors at the college or other tutors that I'm friends with say, oh, I'm an advanced medium. I hear them talk about experience. And I think students should think that, look at their experience and
Yep.
their ability and measure that against their expectation. You know?
And when you talk about experience, Martin, in this modern age, that can be to do with opportunity and money as well. You know, it's not just ability.
Okay, we're nearly at the end, but I know you work a lot abroad and in the UK. What keeps driving you, Sheila?
It is students. I know it sounds a bit twee, you know, a bit archetypal, but I just love to see how it all comes together, how you have they come in a bit nervous, they don't know each other. You know, I'm very keen to bring classes together as a group, you know.
Yes.
There are a lot of my students will go off and have their own practice circles together and things like that. So it's very much seeing this harmony of spirit and waiting for the new inspiration that each new student can bring you. And I know that sounds a bit naff in this modern age, but it's really the joy of watching them grow that keeps me going. It's, you know, let's be honest, going through an airport, you know, people think this international title is wonderful. And I always say it just means you spend hours at an airport waiting for your knickers to arrive, or pants in men's cases. But that's really what it means. There's no glamour in that. But culturally, I think traveling can really, really extend your mediumship, because you have to look at mediumship from different cultures. But it really is to see a student grow. You know, I can proudly say I've only ever had 2 students who've walked away. And one was schizophrenic and not taking the medication, and one was in a very bad place, a very dark place. But other than that, I'm not saying I've kept my students, but they've gone on with other teachers or whatever, to my knowledge. So I think that's the important part, is getting the passion in them, and it fires you with the passion as well.
Yes. Now it's really near the end now, and I've asked every other medium this question that we've had on the couch, and they've all, and again, it's showing people that there's different ideas of how to move things forward, different pathways, individual mediumistic experiences. And what advice would you give to a new medium, or to anyone watching who is thinking of following this lovely pathway?
It's very easy for me to say that, is do it for yourself. Don't do it because you think God's told you to do it. Don't do it because your dead mum's come and given you a reading and say you must do it. Don't do it because somebody said to you, I see it in you, or you've got this feeling, this pressure that you've got to save the world. Do it for yourself because you enjoy doing it. And I think that's really, really important, particularly in this modern age where a lot of students these days are looking for it as a job of the future.
Yeah.
And that's not going to carry on. You know, COVID is going to change it, very possibly. We won't be able to have large classes for a while, things like that. Don't do it because you hate your job and you want a new job. Do it because you like doing it. Do it for yourself. And then you see it's a win-win situation, because you'll feel the love of the spirit, you know, very quickly. You'll get passionate about that love of the spirit. And whether you're ever got the techniques to share it, or the confidence to share it, or the possibilities to share it, you'll still have it for yourself. So I would say do it for yourself, because you choose to do it and because you want to do it. And then it's a win-win situation.
I think that's a lovely place to end that, Sheila. And thank you for the advice. Thank you for agreeing to be on the couch with me. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of this episode of On the Couch with Martin Cokleth. And I'd like to give a big thank you to Sheila French for joining me.
Thank you,
Sheila.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you the next time, folks. Thank you very much.